Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're looking at a super concentrated, incredibly dynamic snapshot of our world on a single day, August 23rd, 2026. Now, if you follow global security and economics, you already know things are moving fast. But what we're going to do today is actually visualize how these massive global events are weaving together literally in real time. So think about this. What happens when a global trade war, a $40 trillion debt, and century-old bombs all collide on the exact same day? I know, it sounds like the plot of a thriller, right? But no, this is our reality. In modern geopolitics, absolutely nothing happens in a vacuum. A local incident on one continent instantly creates a shockwave on another. And that immediate, deep connection, that's the main thread we're pulling on today. To make sense of the chaos, we're breaking it down into 3 areas. Starting with part 1, economic wars and rising debt. Because, as you well know, modern battles, they're usually fought with wallets long before weapons are ever drawn. The economic front is the absolute foundation of the flashpoints we're looking at right now. $40 trillion. I mean, just the sheer impact of all those zeros is staggering, isn't it? As of our reporting date, the United States national debt has officially crossed this historic threshold. And look, this isn't just some domestic bookkeeping headache. A number this massive exerts an immense gravitational pull on the entire global financial system. So what's actually driving the math here? Well, it essentially boils down to 3 primary pillars. We've got high interest rates compounding the cost of borrowing, sustained levels of social spending, and elevated defense costs. It's an objective equation, right? Outlays are just exceeding revenues, and it's being continuously fueled by these 3 distinct elements. And you know what happens when economic pressures like this mount? Bilateral negotiations tend to break down. We're seeing a major tit-for-tat trade war escalation happening right now in North America. The U.S. just slapped 50% tariffs on $20 billion worth of Canadian imports. And in immediate response, like right away, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced reciprocal dollar-for-dollar tariffs kicking in on September 8th. It is a rapid, escalating financial standoff between 2 deeply integrated neighbors. But this financial weaponization isn't just happening in North America. It extends into far more volatile regions. Over in Tehran, the message is crystal clear. They're explicitly calling it an economic war. As the U.S. tightens its sanctions, Iran is framing these moves not just as aggressive policy, but as a literal act of warfare. And they're warning neighboring countries to stay out of the U.S. coalition. It just goes to show exactly how financial leverage is being perceived as a direct physical attack. And the truly crucial point here is how that rhetoric actually translates into physical threats. Iranian officials have made a very specific, incredibly high-stakes threat. If those tightened U.S. economic sanctions proceed, they're going to halt oil exports right through the Strait of Hormuz. For those of you tracking energy markets, you know this choke point is essentially the jugular for global oil transit. It's a textbook, real-world example of using physical geography to counter economic pressure. Which brings us right into part 2, escalation in active war zones. Because when those economic levers are maxed out, physical conflicts inevitably start to heat up. Staying in the Middle East for a moment, the Israeli Defense Forces have reported a whole series of coordinated air and drone strikes. The specific regional targets, Gaza, southern Lebanon, and southwestern Syria, really demonstrate this intense, multi-front operational tempo. It highlights just how widespread the volatility is across the region right now. And of course, this kinetic escalation isn't isolated to the Middle East. Let's look at the incredibly fast sequence of events in Eastern Europe. Step 1. A Russian drone strike hits a shopping center in Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown, leaving at least 15 people dead. Step 2. That direct, localized strike clearly impacts the domestic political stance. President Zelensky rejects calls for wartime elections, arguing that trying to organize a vote during this conflict is just too big a risk to national cohesion. And then, Step 3. The international diplomatic fallout. Russia withdraws its ambassador to the United Kingdom, applying serious pressure over London's long-range missile support for Ukraine. You can literally trace a direct line from a localized drone strike straight to a major diplomatic rupture. And finally, let's move to part 3, unconventional threats and unintended risks. Because beyond the macroeconomics and kinetic warfare we usually talk about, modern global tension is heavily defined by asymmetric and, frankly, some really surprising elements. Remember Iran's warning about economic war just a minute ago? Well, we're already seeing major asymmetric retaliation. An Iranian state-backed cyber attack directly targeted UK energy infrastructure, and it successfully forced a domestic British power plant offline. Think about that. We were just talking about physical trade routes in the Middle East, and now state-linked hackers are shutting down the power in the United Kingdom. That is the stark, everyday reality of cyber warfare. But amidst all this high-tech cyber warfare and digital infrastructure, I want to ask you a question that takes a bit of a dramatic pivot. How on earth are century-old wars complicating modern firefighting? I know, it sounds like a riddle, right? But it's actually one of the most intriguing and honestly surprising historical details in our current global landscape. Here's what's happening. Right now, intense European summer wildfires, these massive, roaring environmental anomalies are sweeping across the continent. But as the ground burns, the intense heat is actually detonating unexploded ordnance, UXO, that has been buried in the dirt since World War I and World War II. So firefighters aren't just battling climate-driven blazes anymore. They're literally dodging century-old bombs that are suddenly exploding all around them. It is just a striking physical example of how the conflicts of the past continue to haunt our present. So, what's the big takeaway here? Why does all of this actually matter to us? Let's synthesize what we've walked through today. First, local trade policies, like a tariff standoff between the US and Canada, those trigger massive global economic shifts. Second, regional drone or airstrikes inherently cause widespread diplomatic fallout, severing ties between major world powers. And finally, century-old history can literally detonate, complicating modern environmental and infrastructure crises. A domestic power outage in the UK, a fiery forest in Europe, or a tariff on Canadian goods. They're all deeply intertwined, and they all dictate global security. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. When global crises are this deeply, instantly connected across economics, cyber domains, and even historical timelines, how do we even begin to manage tomorrow's domino effect? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning those connections, and for sure, I highly encourage you to dig deeper into the sources behind this information to learn more. Catch you next time.